how do we realize that something is an effect? Why do we say that certain things must necessarily have a cause? What is it that allows us to say that something has necessarily been caused? The importance of causality is that only through causality can we demonstrate the existence of God. The only way to demonstrate that there is a God is to demonstrate that the things we see must have a cause for their being. How do we demonstrate this? Every demonstration proceeds from a universal principle, which we consider the major premise. When we demonstrate God's existence, the principle we employ is the principle of causality. Now, how do we formulate this principle? It can be formulated in several ways, but some of them are not useful. For example, every effect has a cause. Effect. This is simply true, but this way of enunciating the principle of causality is useless because it is a tautology. Effect is by definition that which has a cause. If one says that which has a cause, one has said the same thing twice and therefore has said nothing. So, the subject of the principle of causality cannot be effect. Rather, it must be a term or a phrase that on the one hand does not include having a cause in its definition, and on the other hand necessarily requires having a cause. In other words, the predicate of the principle of causality, having a cause, can neither be a synonym of the subject nor be explicitly contained in the idea of the subject. The predicate has to be a progress with respect to the original idea of the subject, even if, once the principle is enunciated, the predicate is seen as a necessary attribute of the subject. To the point. Fabro held that the best subject for the principle of causality was being or ends by participation. The best way to formulate the principle was, for him, the being by participation must have a cause. Every being by participation must have a cause. Now, why must a being by participation be caused? Why is being by participation the best subject for this principle? For some, having a participated being means having a received being. And therefore, since what is received is necessarily received from another, a participated being has necessarily received its being from another, from the cause. All this is true, at least in a sense, but it cannot be what Fabro meant. As you may notice, this is the same tautology as before. To say having a participated being would mean the same as to say having one's own being received from another. And therefore, it would also mean having one's own being caused by another. Now, if being by participation means being caused by another, then saying that being by participation must be caused is saying twice the same thing. So, this is not the way to understand what Fabro meant. oh, being by participation is being a being which has been received. No, that's not what he meant. If you say so, then you are making a tautology of what Fabro said. For Fabro, in the enunciation of the principle of causality, being by participation meant something different. And I quote, imperfect, finite, and therefore participated is the being that does not show fully realized in itself the act and form of being, but only a deficient likeness or some degree thereof. Participare, he says, partem capere. Participating means for Fabro, part-taking, to take a part. So participating for Fabro means to possess in a particular, limited, imperfect way that which in another is found totally by essence. And I quote, according to St. Thomas, to participate is a being partially possessing, which is opposed to being possessing, receiving totally. Participating, he says, is predicated of a subject which has a certain formality or act, but not exclusively and in a total way. So, why then does being by participation understood in this way necessarily require that it be caused? This is the main point we want to address. We want to justify the evidence and necessity of the principle of causality so that when we use it to demonstrate the existence of God, the argumentation is solid and not based on tautologies. There is another possible misunderstanding about the principle of causality in terms of participation. The notion of being by participation seems to imply the notion of being by essence, or the notion of total, intensive being. Indeed, nothing is understood as a part unless in reference to a whole, which is therefore presupposed. Thus, it is clear that being by participation depends on being by essence in order to be understood. Now, could we move from this notional dependence to a real dependence? We cannot. In fact, when we say being by participation, we do not say it with respect to a real being by essence, but by reference to an intensive notion of being, which is the product of a certain metaphysical reflection. In other words, we consider being, the ens, as part, not by a comparison between this particular being and God, whom we have not seen, but by comparison between this being and what for us being means. What does it mean, being, for me? A lot of things. This thing, all the things I've ever seen. Okay, when I say that this being is a participated being, what I mean is that this is part of what it means to be for me. Okay, that's what I mean. Nothing else yet. So being means many things, whereas this being limited is only a part of it. Being by participation depends on the notion of being in order to be understood, but it cannot depend on this notion in reality because this notion as such does not exist. It's just in my mind. The notion is presupposed, but not the actual existence of the notion. If it does not exist, it cannot be the cause of anything. Therefore, the mere notional dependence cannot justify the leap to a real dependence. We could put it this way. If the whole for which I say that this being is a part is not real, what would lead me to affirm that it must exist? The whole. Why would the whole exist? If to begin with it's just a notion. And how can I affirm a relation of real dependence with something that does not exist? Okay, so this is the second thing that I want to avoid, is to think of, why participated being implies a cause? Well, because when you say part, you imply whole, and therefore the whole exists. Now, wait a minute. You say part regarding a notional whole. The whole is not there yet, unless you do something. You demonstrate, you do something. Okay. Certainly, one can infer the existence of the cause departing from the being by participation in the way that we will show. But one must not confuse the necessity of a notional whole, the notion of being, with the real existence of the cause, the being with capital letters. And we cannot make the notional dependence coincide with the real dependence. Okay. That being said, and this was just the introduction, but the points are more or less the same. The first point, we will try to differentiate our problem from other questions connected with the principle of causality. Second, and this will be the main point, we will propose a critical justification of the principle of causality following the doctrine of Fabro and St. Thomas, putting particular emphasis on the notion of being which is not because of itself. And third, we will attempt to justify our emphasis on this notion by resorting to some texts of St. Thomas. So, the first point, the critical justification of the principle of causality and other related issues. As mentioned above, in this paper, we want to justify the evidence of the principle of causality so that when we use it to demonstrate the existence of God, the argumentation will be solid. Now, it is not the same to justify the evidence of the principle of causality as to prove a conclusion starting from that principle. The former ends by affirming something about the principle of cause, that is to say, that the principle is evident and necessary, that it is true, etc. While the latter ends by affirming the cause of an effect, as when we demonstrate the existence of God, or the being caused of an effect, when we demonstrate the creation of every finite being. So one of those things St. Thomas does in question 2 of the prima parts. The other thing St. Thomas does in question 44. And the justification of the principle has nothing to do with those 2 things. In those 2 things that St. Thomas does, he's using the principle. What we want to do is to justify the principle. Moreover, the justification of the principle of cause ends in a formulation of it that is considered immediately evident and true. We thus obtain the affirmation of the principle of causality with absolute or general necessity, but at the same time a hypothetical necessity. In this sense, the principle of cause affirms something in general of every effect, but does not affirm it of any effect in particular, or of all beings in general. In other words, the principle of causality, every being by participation must have a cause. That principle does not assert that in fact to this being or to these beings or to every being there corresponds a cause. It's not the same. What we assert is that on principle, if a being is in a certain way, then a cause necessarily corresponds to it. Thus, when one affirms that every being by participation is caused, one is not necessarily affirming that every finite being outside of God must be caused, unless one has already shown that God exists and that every being outside of God is a being by participation. When one asserts the principle of cause by saying that every being by participation is or must be caused, what one is asserting is that if a being is by participation in some respect, then it must have a cause in that same respect. It's a general hypothetical affirmation. In metaphysics, the principle of causality is used in the reasoning secundum rem, both in the resolution and in the composition. That is to say, this principle guides us in the demonstration of God's existence, which is the resolutio secundum rem, and in the characterization of every finite being outside of God as caused, which is compositio secundum rem in the Summa, what St. Thomas does in question 1, article 44. Prima pars, question 44. Article 1. In both cases, our reasoning ends in an affirmation of a fact and according to extrinsic causes, which is proper to the quia reasoning. We will not I'll talk about that another time. Now, and this is, I think, very important. I always emphasize this. It is not the same to prove that the fact that there are some beings by participation requires the existence of God as cause, as to prove that every finite being must be caused in its being by God. The subject of the first affirmation is God. God exists. God must be there. The subject of the second affirmation is every finite being. The predicate of the first affirmation is existence. The predicate of the second affirmation is being caused. This is why we must not confuse what St. Thomas is doing in the prima pars question 2, which is the first, that's the conclusion of his argument, with that which St. Thomas is doing in question 44, even if in both cases he is using the same principle of causality and the same notion of participation. He's not using it the same way, and he's not talking about the same. Down here, he's presupposing that God exists, and he's talking about every finite being, not about some. In the first case, in question 2, he's moving from some participated being. Nobody can demonstrate the existence of God talking about all beings because you have not seen them. It's not a fact of experience that every being is by participation. You've not seen them all. Okay? It's a different thing. Now, having distinguished these three problems, justification of the principle, demonstration of God's existence, demonstration of creation, I intend to reflect on the first one, that is to say, on the evidence of the principle of causality. I will offer a development of Fabre's position based on 3 of his main works on the topic. His article La Difesa Critica, The Critical Defense, of 1936, and his books La Nozione Metafisica di Partecipazione and Participation and Causality. My presentation could be taken as an interpretation of his original position in the light of his later works, and as an attempt to deepen and reinforce Fabre's defense of the principle of cause. That was the first point, now second and third. They are more or less all the same. Okay. Critical defense of the principle of causality. In the following lines, it should be noted that although direct reference is made to being only, as the most common act possessed by any ens, all expressions could be understood of being such. So not just about being, but about being anything. Being hot, being good, being glad, being whatever. Whatever can be by participation. Okay. This means that these expressions must be understood in a universal way for all kinds of causality, not only for causal dependence with respect to being. Thus, for example, when we say, why does being by participation necessitate causal dependence, the reasoning could be applied to the question, why does being such by participation, etc. In the same way, the phrase, this does not possess being for being what it is, could also be valid if one were to say, does not possess being such for being what it is, and so on in the other expressions, except when obvious reference is made to being and God. So, to the point. Why does being by participation require causal dependence? The participated being shows that it does not have being for being what it is. Indeed, that which is common to many cannot belong to each one for being what it is, because each one is distinct from the others, and that which makes them distinct cannot be the principle of that which is possessed in common. Therefore, being, which is common, cannot come to each one for being what it is. Moreover, nothing can be deficient in that which it has as proper, that is, in that which it has for being what it is, because it would cease to be what it is. Now, to have something partially is to be deficient in that very thing which one has. Therefore, nothing can have partially that which it has as proper. But every being ends by participation has been partially. Therefore, the being by participation does not have being as proper, that is, for being what it is. The example of the fire is always the easiest. Why is the pot hot? Because of itself? No. Why is fire hot? Because of itself? Yeah, because fire must be hot. Now, can heat be partially possessed in the fire? In a sense, no. It's actually lit or not. You cannot cool down the fire, okay? But you can cool down the pot because it has it partially. It's not its own. So the point, the principle is, nothing can have partially that which belongs to you because of what you are. Another example. If you have blue eyes, and that's how you are, you cannot not have blue eyes. Because another person may not have them, but if having blue eyes belong to you, because to this person is then if he doesn't have them, he's another person. Okay? It's another person. You can't have what belongs to you in a part. You either have it or not. Okay? Well, that's the point. So being by participation is always a being which is not in virtue of itself. What you have partially, you have it not for being what you are, but because of something else. In summary, the analysis of the notion of being by participation leads us to say that such a being does not have being for being what it is. Now, saying that a being is not for being what it is the same as saying that it is not by itself or because of itself. If it is, but not by itself, then it must be by another. And this is so because if one denies that a being is by itself, and also denies that it is by one other than itself, then one denies every possibility of its existence. There is no third possibility. And one arrives at the absurdity of denying the very being that was the starting point. In other words, if the being by participation is not by itself, and is not by one different from itself, then it is not, which contradicts the very position of the being by participation. Put in a more syllogistic way, one could say that all that is not in virtue of itself must be in virtue of another. Why? Because if it is, it has only two possibilities. It's either because of itself or because of another. If you deny both, then it's not there. But if it is, it has to be one of them. There is no third possibility. So that is a general principle. All that is not in virtue of itself must be in virtue of another. Now, the being by participation is not in virtue of itself, because of the other explanation we did. I mean, what you have as your own, because of what you are, you don't have partially. You have it or not. If you have it partially, then you don't have it in virtue of yourself. Therefore, the being by participation must be in virtue of another, which is what causality means, to be in virtue of another or because of another. Saying that a being must be by another or in virtue of another is affirming that it depends on another in being, and this is causal dependence. In this way, in my view, the necessity of causal dependence in the being by participation is clearly shown. This critical defense would apply to any kind of efficient causality in general. Okay. Allow us here a comparison which, although it refers particularly to divine causality with respect to being, may help us to understand the connection between being by participation and being which is not because of itself. Let us imagine a small water stream flowing in the woods. The water flows at this moment. The very movement of the water and the continuous appearance of new water necessitate the existence of the source. In the same way, the being ends, which at this moment is in the act of existing, which is continually in the present, passing from nothingness to being. This being necessitates a source, which is the reason for the act. For just as the water by itself does not provide a reason for its movement, so the being by participation does not provide a reason for its present act of being. It's, in a sense, jumping from nothingness to being right now. It's like, okay. As may be seen, we are far from a consideration of being as a result, as already done. That which exists is now, and this being now is what requires a cause now, because that which exists moves, passes from nothingness to being, but not by itself. It doesn't have to be, but it is. There is like a flow of being that has no explanation in this ends, because this ends is not by itself. That is to say, being does not belong to it because it is this ends. And so, it is necessary to put a primordial source of being, the cause. In Aquinas' 5 ways, that which is presented as the point of departure, at the point of departure as a fact of experience, is always something whose present and actual perfection cannot be explained by the thing itself that possesses it. Thus, first way, the thing passing from potency into act cannot pass into act by itself, but in fact makes this passage and therefore must pass into act by another. The second way, the middle cause cannot be the cause of the ultimate effect by itself, but it is cause, and therefore it is a cause by virtue of the first cause. Contingent being, in the third way, contingent being cannot be explained ultimately by itself, but by necessary being. The fourth way, being by participation cannot be explained except by the being per essentiam. In the fifth way, ordered being is not explained except by ordering being, intelligent being. In this sense, it could be said that all of the 5 ways are based on the perception of a being by participation, that is, of a being that possesses something, a perfection, but whose possession does not find its ultimate explanation in the subject itself, and therefore forces us to look for a cause. Okay, the third point now. So what is the relationship between the critical, the third point is the notion of being which is not because of itself in Fabro and in St. Thomas. What is the relationship between the critical defense of the principle of cause proposed here and the doctrine of Father Fabro? In general terms, it is clear that these reasonings respect the main points of Fabro's teaching. What is added, in my opinion, is a special valorization of the notion of being which is not per se in the argumentation. In my opinion, the only thing that can demand the reference to another, founding causality, is the dialectic one itself, other, one or the other, where denied the one as the principle of actual being, thanks to the notion of participation, the other must be affirmed. It's either or. If you can show that by means of the being by participation, if you can show that it's either or, then when you take out one, then the other remains. And this reference to the other is what grounds causality. In my view, is the best way to see it. As Father Fabro himself would say, from the fact that something is not because of itself, it follows that it is because of another. These are words from him, and they come from the first article, for which I think what I'm doing is simply unpacking something that was in his mind, but not explicitly. Now, do we follow Aquinas' doctrine when we emphasize the notion of being which is not per se? Because Fabro certainly follows St. Thomas with the notion of participation. Now, my emphasis on being which is not per se, is it Thomistic? Okay. A text from De Potentia can enlighten us regarding how St. Thomas himself uses the notion of insufficient being, or being which is not per se, to prove the necessity of causal dependence in the being which manifests itself as participating. We go to the first text. There is 2 of these. Okay. Can the whole thing fit? You don't need the title. You don't need the title. You can put it bigger. So it's a whole syllogism. you can. You can? Okay. So in Aquinas' first argument, which is what you are seeing now, the word participation does not appear, but the argument is presented as the proof of creation taken from the Platonic school, that is, as the ratio Platonis. Moreover, Fabro cites this text as one of the formulas of participation in his article La Difesa Critica. Here is the text. You can read it, no? If in a number of things we find something that is common to all, we must conclude that this something was the effect of some one cause. For it is not possible that this common something belong to each one by reason of itself, since each one by itself is different from the others. And diversity of causes produces a diversity of effects. Seeing then that being is found to be common to all things, which are by themselves distinct from one another, it follows of necessity that they must come into being not by themselves, but by the action of some cause. Seemingly, this is Plato's argument, since he required every multitude to be preceded by unity, not only as regards number, but also in reality. In this text, we can see how the elimination of one member of the disjunctive forces us to affirm the other member. If they cannot be by reason of themselves, then they must be by reason of another. Thus, the reason that a participated perfection, what is common to many, is caused, is that a participated perfection does not belong to something for being what it is. So, how does St. Thomas explain the notion of being common with the notion of being which is not because of itself? So, being common is like being participated, is one of the ways of understanding it. So, it could be objected that this text belongs to the Compositio Secundum Rem, question 44 in the prima parts, since it is a parallel to Summa, question 44, where St. Thomas wants to demonstrate that every finite being must be created by God, and not the existence of God. St. Thomas is not here demonstrating the existence of God. And therefore, God's existence, that is, this text wants to demonstrate the causal dependence of every finite being with respect to God. And therefore, God's existence is presupposed. This would mean that the principle of participation is not being used to demonstrate that there must be a cause, but rather that the cause of every ens which participates in being must be God. So, Father, you are trying to justify the principle of causality. Here, we are not demonstrating that every being must have a cause, but that every being's cause is God. So it's not the same, so your argument may not work. Nonetheless, the major premise with a big M, the major premise, is a general principle that can be applied both to the demonstration of the existence of God and to the demonstration of creation, since it does not presuppose the existence of a cause. If in a number of things we find something that is common to all, we must conclude that this something was the effect of some one cause. That principle is the same principle of the fourth way. Moreover, the justification of the major premise, just M, justification of the major premise, That is to say, the reason why that which is common to many individuals must be caused is that what is common cannot belong to any of the individuals in virtue of itself. So, being by participation, here being as common, is explained through the notion of being which is not by virtue of itself, which is the point we want to emphasize about the text. Finally, the closing lines of the paragraph, seemingly this is Plato's argument, the closing lines of the paragraph shows how the emphasis is placed on the fact that Plato sought unity behind the many, and therefore the Platonic principle takes the likeness of a resolutio secundum rem, that is, of going to the efficient cause starting from the effects, so from the many to the one. Whatever. Now, if the Platonic principle refers to the resolution secundum rem, and therefore to the demonstration of the existence of the cause, why does St. Thomas use it here, where the existence of the cause is presupposed? Okay? So I'm saying that it's the principle of causality. But St. Thomas is not demonstrating that God exists, he's presupposing that God exists. So, well, what is he doing? Well, for two reasons he's using this principle. First, because St. Thomas wants to conclude that the universal cause is one, God, which has a certain resemblance to seeking unity behind the multitude. Second, because the fact that the principle of causality, which is this Platonic principle, is used in the resolutio secundum rem, does not mean that it cannot be used in the compositio secundum rem, which is what St. Thomas is doing here. And let us see how. So the Platonic principle is the following. If something one is found in many as common, then it must be caused in them by a single cause. Now, what is said of that which is common to many can be applied to that which is common to all. In this case, what matters is not how many there are, but that they are more than one. That is, it doesn't matter whether they are many or all. Now, St. Thomas affirms in the minor premise that being appears to be common to all things. Therefore, Aquinas is not demonstrating that there must be a cause for some. He is demonstrating that this cause is the cause of all things, because all things possess being as common. Thus, the minor premise, see the minor premise with the little m? The minor premise, which attributes being universally to all things, even those which have not been seen, presupposes having demonstrated that the ipsum esse subsistence can be only one, and therefore presupposes the demonstration of God's existence. If the being by essence can be only one, then all other beings, not just some, will have being by participation. And a little, and then the next text, trying to show the same thing, how the notion of participation is explained by the notion of being which is not in virtue of itself, by St. Thomas. The text immediately following, still in De Potentia, question 3, article 5, is also helpful to see how St. Thomas explains causal dependence in the participated being by an appeal to the notion of being which is not in virtue of itself. The second argument is that whenever something is found to be in several things in various ways participated, it must be attributed to those in which it exists imperfectly, in virtue of that one in which it exists most perfectly. Because where there are positive degrees of a thing, so that we ascribe it to this one more and to that one less, This is in reference to one thing to which they approach, one nearer than another. For if each one were of itself competent to have it, there would be no reason why one should have it more than another. Thus, fire, which is the extreme of heat, is the cause of heat in all things hot. Now there is one being most perfect and most true, which follows from the fact that there is a mover altogether immovable and absolutely perfect, as philosophers have proved. Consequently, all other less perfect beings must needs derive being therefrom. This is the argument of the philosopher. Okay. Here, the major premise, the big M, is a general principle that presupposes the existence of the maximum and therefore cannot be used to demonstrate the existence of God. However, the explanation following this premise, expl M, the explanation following this premise is an even more general principle which can be used also for said demonstration. This is where we see, as in the previous paragraph, that what is something by participation, here secundum magis et minus, must have that very thing caused because it cannot have it of itself, because of itself. The minor premise which follows, the little m, is the affirmation that in fact there is a maximum, an affirmation that can be demonstrated, clarifies St. Thomas. With this clarification, Aquinas seems to interrupt the syllogism, but in reality, his reference to the demonstration of God's existence is precisely the proof of the minor premise. The conclusion is that every less perfect being will be caused by the most perfect being. So the path to reach this conclusion was the following. In general, if something possesses a perfection at its maximum, then it is the cause of all others who possess this perfection by degrees. Now, there is one who possesses being at its maximum. Therefore, this being will be the cause of all those who possess being by degrees. Now, the principle of causality explained through the notion of being which is not in virtue of itself in this demonstration is simply an explanation of the major premise. So, what I'm talking about today is in expo M. Is the principle of participation explained by the notion of being which is not because of itself. However, St. Thomas uses precisely here the vocabulary of more and less, magis et minus, and the example of fire as in the fourth way. He's doing exactly the same. And this shows that it is the same principle of causality used in the fourth way. My intention was to show how St. Thomas explains causal dependence in the being by participation through this notion of being which is not in virtue of itself. Conclusion: that which necessitates causal dependence in the being by participation is that such a being is not in virtue of itself, and therefore must be in virtue of another. The being by participation cannot be such in virtue of itself because one cannot have partially what one has for being what one is. One is not partially oneself. Now, if one possesses something but does not possess it in virtue of oneself, then one must possess it in virtue of another. This possessing a perfection by reason of a being other than oneself is what we call causal dependence. In the being by participation, this dependence is necessary, because otherwise the actual possession of the participated perfection could not be explained. That is, if one does not possess something in virtue of oneself, and does not possess it in virtue of another either, then one does not possess it at all. Now, if it is in fact possessed, and not in virtue of itself, then it is possessed in virtue of another. This seems to be the doctrine of Father Fabro and St. Thomas as well. Even if this defense applies to the principle of causality in general, this paper has not explored in what way this principle could be applied to other instances of efficient causality, for example, in the predicamental realm. Thank you for your attention.